Good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes for everybody to file in, and then we will go ahead and start the webinar in about 4 minutes now, so 10:05.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first informal workshop related to the SB 343 and AB 881 Rdrs rulemaking. From CalRecycle, we have Eric Payne, who's leading our rulemaking. My name is Priya Balasubramaniam. I'm a member of the rulemaking team, and I will be giving today's presentation. We also have with us our manager, Dan Brown, who will present a foreword before we get started on our presentation. Please note that this workshop is being recorded. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Priya. So good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Brown, and I am the manager of the Knowledge Integration section within CalRecycle's Policy Development and Analysis Office. I want to thank you all for attending our first informal rulemaking discussion for changes to the Recycling and Disposal Reporting System, or RDRS. As many of you know, SB 343 and AB 881 were passed into law last year, requiring CalRecycle to gather new information in RDRS. We see this as an opportunity to gain greater understanding of the types of materials that are being processed at California facilities and identifying contaminants in that processing. Your participation and feedback are greatly appreciated and are critical to crafting regulatory changes that are effective and feasible. So with that, I will turn things back over to Priya.
Thank you, Dan. Let's get started with our presentation today. In this presentation, I will be covering the following: a brief background about the rulemaking, a timeline of our rulemaking and RDRS updates, introduction to the SB 343 and AB 881 statutes, a roadmap of changes or proposed regulations pursuant to SB 343 and AB 881 as it pertains to RDRS, other regulatory changes as they relate to RDRS, dates of future workshops and resources related to rulemaking. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions, we look forward to addressing them at the end of the presentation. Two new statutes were passed in 2021, which impact RDRS, SB 343 and AB 881. These will necessitate changes to our regulations pertaining to RDRS. Over the next few months, we will continue to develop RDRS regulations based on internal and external feedback, stakeholder feedback, and we will also begin our formal rulemaking process. The SB 343 statute gives us a rulemaking deadline of January 1st, 2024. So our rulemaking process is governed by this deadline. As part of the effort to inform our stakeholders and solicit their feedback, we will be holding 3 informal workshops, the first being this one. The second and third workshops will be held on July 26th and August 30th. We expect to begin a formal rulemaking around October to November of this year. Moving on to what SB 343 is all about. SB 343 was passed to prohibit false or misleading recyclability claims for products and packaging, such as adding a chasing arrow symbol unless the product or packaging was considered recyclable in the state of California. The statute also prohibits selling products with false and misleading recyclability claims. The statute defines recyclability for the above purpose. A material is considered recyclable in California if it satisfies the following 2 conditions. The material type and form is collected for recycling by recycling programs that collectively encompass at least 60% of the population of the state, and the material type and form is sorted into defined streams for recycling processes by large volume transfer processors that collectively serve at least 60% of recycling programs statewide. In order to provide information on what is recyclable in the state, the statute empowers CalRecycle to conduct periodic material characterization studies and collect information on recovered materials, which is reported in RDRS. This latter part is what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. AB 881, passed in 2021, mandates considering the export of mixed plastic waste out of the country as disposal for calculating a jurisdiction's diversion rate pursuant to AB 939. However, it's important to note mixed plastic waste does not include plastics 1, 2, and 5, present codes of 1, 2, and 5. Additionally, until January 1st, 2024, or the expiration of a relevant trade agreement with Canada or Mexico, whichever is later, export out of the country does not also include export to Canada or Mexico. SB 343 and AB 881 requires us to update our regulations. These statutes do not change who is required to report, but they do change what is required to be reported. For example, if you're not currently required to report in RDRS, you will not be required to report by regulations resulting pursuant to SB 343 and AB 881. We also expect that changes in reporting in RDRS will take effect from Q4 2024. Let's delve into how SB 343 impacts reporting in RDRS. According to the Public Resources Code that you see on the slide, by 1st January 2024, CalRecycle must adopt regulations to include the following two information in the reports that entities submit to CalRecycle: how the material collected or processed by the operations and facilities was collected, and what material types and forms are actively recovered and not considered contaminants by the operation or facility. The statute also requires CalRecycle to publish this information. In the following slides, we want to give you a preview of the proposed regulatory changes. At this point, we are not ready to show you the actual regulatory draft text due to internal review requirements. So some of what we are going over may seem a bit vague, but feel free to ask any questions or comments in the end. Since SB 343 requires entities to report on how the material processed by facilities was collected, the proposed regulations will require a definition for collection method. Collection method will primarily incorporate information spanning source sector, stream type, and bin type. For example, a collection method could be contract haul, residential, dual bin recycling. Since entities are required to report collection method, this will necessitate new data collection. For example, haulers will be required to gather data on collection method. Entities such as recyclers, transfer processors that accept material directly from generators will also be required to gather collection method. Example, self-hauled residential mixed recycling. Collection method information will be gathered on materials that were received or sent for purposes other than disposal or beneficial reuse. How can entities gather this information? Haulers may utilize any of the following: contract agreements, billing records, hauling routes, and any alternative method that has been approved by CalRecycle. Other reporting entities that receive material from generators can use analogous methods as source sector, example, vehicle type. Reporting entities that receive material from haulers will get this information from the hauler. And reporting entities that receive material from another reporting entity other than a hauler will assign collection method as the source activity type. For example, if an entity received material from a recycler composter, the collection method assigned would be recycler composter. Along with new data collection requirements, there is also new reporting requirements for collection method. Recyclers, composters, transfer processors, and disposal facilities will report collection method for inflows of material that were accepted for purposes other than beneficial reuse or disposal. Haulers and broker transporters will report collection method for outflows of material that were sent for purposes other than beneficial reuse or disposal. However, note that haulers will report this data only when they are required by RDRS to report. SB 343 requires entities to report on what material types and forms are actively recovered. However, this is not new reporting, as RDRS already collects material type information on tons sent for recycling and end use. However, the statute requires reporting on actively recovered material types and forms, and the current material list in RDRS is a mixture of types and forms. Therefore, CalRecycle staff will update the material list to separate between type and form. Additionally, when reporting mixed materials, entities that sell or transfer mixed materials will now be required to list the constituent materials within the mixture. SB 343 requires the department to publish a list of material types and forms that are actively recovered. However, we won't make any regulatory updates due to the publishing requirement of SB 343. CalRecycle will add or amend existing public reports to publish this information. The publication of this information will also not reveal any otherwise confidential information as specified in the regulations. Let's move on to AB 881 and how that impacts RDRS. According to the Public Resources Code you see on the slide, AB 881 requires entities to submit to RDRS the jurisdiction of origin for exported mixed plastic waste. It also requires CalRecycle to publish this information. AB 881 necessitates data collection requirements. Primarily, all entities that handle mixed plastic waste will have to record jurisdiction of origin information for those materials. A key point to note is that if an entity handles materials containing mixed plastic waste that could be extracted and exported by another downstream entity, then the upstream entity will need to record origins for the mixed recyclables. Mixed plastic waste is defined here for purposes of jurisdiction of origin reporting and will not be a new material type stream to report in RDRS. Along with the data collection requirements, there are also data transfer requirements. All entities that handle mixed plastic waste and/or materials containing mixed plastic waste will have to pass along jurisdiction of origin for those materials to the next entity in the chain. For example, a pathway of material flow could be if a hauler sends material to a recycler composter, who then sends it to a transfer processor that exports the mixed plastic waste. The hauler will need to pass origins to the recycler composter, who will need to pass it along to the transfer processor. When passing along jurisdiction of origin information, such as client and customer lists are not required. Instead, only the proportion of tons from each jurisdiction need to be passed along. Along with collecting and passing along jurisdiction of origin information, AB 881 also has new reporting requirements. AB 881 requires that entities who export mixed plastic waste report those tons in RDRS, as well as the jurisdiction of origins for those tons. Note that the reporting requirements for outflows have otherwise not changed. For example, a recycler composter sending mixed plastic waste to a transfer processor will still need to report that outflow in RDRS. How can entities gather data on origins of mixed plastic waste? Haulers can utilize contract agreements, billing records, etc. Entities that receive material from generators will use the same methods as before, example, asking self-haulers their origin. Entities that receive material from another reporting entity will obtain origins from that sending entity. Along with requiring origins information for exported mixed plastic waste, AB 881 also changes the definition of disposal to include exported mixed plastic waste. We will be updating the regulatory definition of disposal to match Section 18794.2c. This change will affect disposal tons assigned to jurisdictions in California for the electronic annual report. AB 881 requires CalRecycle to publish the jurisdiction of origin and the tonnage of exported mixed plastic waste. This will result in additions to existing public reports, such as Public Report 1. To summarize the regulatory updates discussed thus far, in the definitions section of the RDRS regulations, we will add new definitions for collection method, export, and mixed plastic waste. We will also update new methods for gathering collection method information and methods to determine and pass along origins data for mixed plastic waste. We will update the definition of disposal to include exported mixed plastic waste. The new requirements resulting from these two statutes are that entities will now be required to collect and report data on collection method for materials sent or received for purposes other than beneficial reuse or disposal. Entities will be required to provide the constituent list of materials when sending outflows of mixed materials. Entities will be required to report jurisdiction of origin information for exported mixed plastic waste, and entities will need to provide origins to the destination entity for outflows of mixed plastic waste. In addition to the regulatory changes pursuant to AB 881 and SB 343, the department is considering other regulatory changes to clarify and optimize processes based on valuable feedback from our stakeholders, as well as our internal review processes that we've gained over the past 2 years of Rdrs reporting. We intend to provide a summary of these changes in the next workshop. Some examples of updates we're considering are: we will be clarifying process for correcting errors in quarterly reports. We are proposing requiring entities to provide their Swiss number if they have one. And we're working on clarifications to registration requirements and associated processes. We have 2 more workshops scheduled for July 26th and August 30th. Please plan to attend them, as we hope to cover our other regulatory updates in those workshops. The registration information for these workshops will be available in the rulemaking website listed in the slide. We will post draft regulatory language and other relevant documents to the rulemaking process on this webpage. We also have a listserv, which we encourage entities to join to get more information on our rulemaking. And if you have any questions or concerns or feedback, we encourage you to email them to us at our rulemaking email address shown in the slide. Thank you for your attention. If you're viewing this presentation via GoToWebinar, you can use the raise hand or ask question feature to ask questions. If you're having any technical difficulties in using the questions box or the raise hand feature, please send your questions to us directly via the chat box. Else, we prefer that you use the raise hand feature or you drop your questions in the question box. If you're viewing this as a webcast, you can send your comments or questions to our rulemaking email listed on the slide. Thank you once again for your attendance and attention.
Priya, we have a question for, can you repeat the schedule on the first slides for the rulemaking? So we can leave the email up here. I'll just say out loud, Larry, that we're going to have another 2 informal workshops. One will be on July 26th. The second will be on August 30th. And then we intend to start formal rulemaking in October to November of this year, 2023, because pursuant to the statute SB 343, we have to finalize our regulations by January 1st, 2024. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. We have another question from Greg Kester. Are biosolids which are recycled to agricultural land or other reclamation projects considered recyclable materials under SB 343? Eric, would you like to take that question?
Sure. So to kind of back up, SB 343 is really focused on materials that are going to have like a chasing arrow symbol, you know, the 3 arrows that are in line in a triangle that you'll see on many plastics, with the intent of that being the law is trying to prevent manufacturers and advertisers from making false claims about the recyclability of a product. So for the purposes of determining recyclability, I don't really think that biosolids are going to fall into kind of that purview. But I'm not sure how that will shake out in terms of the regulations, because I think it can be difficult to include those types of minor exemptions when we're thinking about all the potential material types that might or might not be relevant. But I highly encourage you to keep that comment in mind and bring that forward for our future informal meetings and into the formal rulemaking as well, to make sure that we can address that to your satisfaction. But I'm sorry, I don't have a clear-cut answer at the moment.
We have another question from Omar Numer. Where can we get a copy of today's presentation? We will be posting a link to the recording on our rulemaking webpage, and you'll be able to get a copy of the recording, and we'll also probably post a handout of the presentation. Another question from Rick Mock. Why is it important to know the jurisdiction of origin for these junk mixed plastics?
Sure, I can take that one, Priya.
Okay.
So the materials, or as a department, right, we're not taking a stance on whether these mixed plastics are junk or not, but the statute treats mixed plastic waste as waste. And the reason that we need to know the jurisdiction of origin is because other statutes require that jurisdictions keep track of how many tons they are disposing, where disposing means disposed in state or even exported out of California. And so what AB 881, has done is to say that these mixed plastic wastes that are exported out of country, these are now considered disposal for these jurisdictions. Prior to AB 881, these jurisdictions could generate mixed plastic waste, send it out of country, and that would be considered recycling for the purposes of keeping track of these jurisdictions' disposal. So the reason we need to track the jurisdiction is so that we can appropriately assign the tons of mixed plastic waste that are exported out of California or out of country, actually, back to the jurisdiction of origin. So for example, this is an extreme case, but let's say that Sacramento, California was sending a million tons of mixed plastic waste to Malaysia. Previously, before AB 881, those tons would all be considered recycling. But now, once AB 881 and the regulations take effect, those tons will be assigned as disposal to the jurisdiction as part of the electronic annual report.
Thanks, Eric. Another question from Ria Verghese. How will the three workshops be different from each other? I think the first workshop. I can answer that one too, Priya,
since I'm just talking. Yeah, the first workshop, as we saw, of course, was focused on 343 and AB 881. Our second workshop, we're hoping to focus on our other general changes, which Priya noted at the end of the workshop in a very overview sort of way. And then the last workshop, we're planning to kind of go over any new changes we've made based on comments that we've received during these meetings, as well as provide more detail about the regulations that we are proposing to change for AB 881, SB 343, and the regulatory changes. So if you want to think about it this way, the third workshop will be more of a capstone where we're showing kind of more detail about everything, and the second one will be focused or try to focus on the general updates we're going to make to the regulations.
We have another question from Neil Tyrell. When does CalRecycle believe the data will be available to allow producers to know if they need to modify current package recycling labeling?
So for SB 343, there are actually two components of that related to kind of what our group does. One is this RDRS regulatory updates. The other is the material characterization studies that the statute has required us to do. The material characterization study is set to be published by law by January 1st, 2024. So that's when we will be publishing the first set of data relevant to kind of how you're supposed to determine if a product or packaging is recyclable. In terms of the data that we'll be collecting from RDRS, there's not really a clear guideline or requirement in statute about when we have to make that available. It's sort of as we collect that data. The main limitation that we have regarding the RDRS portion of the data is the development time, because there's going to be new things that we're asking people to report in RDRS, and that will require development time for us to change RDRS, and then also training time to get all of our stakeholders on board with how to report that information in RDRS. Currently, and this may change, our regulatory updates are set to take effect as of 2024 Q4. So we would have, at earliest, we would have data starting really around 2025 Q1. But that may change as we move forward with comments from others and sort of internal feedback as well.
A question from James Edwards. Is the intent to only allow the chasing arrow symbol when California considers the material recyclable? If so, can other symbols such as the ASTM symbol be used?
Dan, I think you might be a better one to answer that than me.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So we are not the ones, and when I say we, I mean CalRecycle is not the one that is really the arbiter of what is appropriate symbology. That is established by the statute. We do not have a delegated role in determining the appropriateness of labeling. So I realize that that doesn't necessarily directly answer the question, but it really highlights that review the language of SB 343 to see how it addresses those sorts of conditions.
A question from Lauren Shapiro. How will CalRecycle resolve issues where some state and global jurisdictions require certain recyclability symbols, including chasing arrows on packaging?
That actually falls into the same category as my prior response, which is really that we are not determining whether or not recycling symbols are appropriate or not. We're simply capturing and publishing the information such that the producers and the public has information with which to make that determination.
A question from Carlos Chavez. Lots of recycling centers allow the public to walk up to bins, drop off their recyclables, and then leave without interacting with staff. Are you expecting these sites to start weighing and surveying this type of activity?
That's a great question. Thanks for that. I think it, in a truly ideal world, it would be what we would want from a maximum data perspective is that everybody who's coming up gives you where they're coming from. But I realize, and we, the royal we in CalRecycle, realizes that that may not necessarily be possible in all circumstances, and that might be an extreme kind of economic burden for some entities to start collecting that information. So the way our regulations are actually written right now, to give you a preview, is we're basically providing methods to allow you to collect jurisdiction from people who are walking up. But if it's not possible for you to collect jurisdiction of origin by asking people because you're not asking anyone who comes up, our regulations are providing flexibility for you to propose alternative methods, or even to host assign those materials to yourself, where host assign means that if your facility is located in unincorporated Sacramento, all of the materials that you receive that don't otherwise have a jurisdiction of origin would be earmarked for unincorporated Sacramento. But I think that's a really great point. And if you have any suggestions for how to gather origins for these types of scenarios in an appropriate way, we'd be happy to hear it. And you can just email us at the email listed on the screen. But if not, that's okay too. Thank you.
Kat Garcia mentions that she just sent a question via email. Thank you, Kat. We will respond to it. Valerie Meza asked a question. So will the hauler need to separate out the plastic residual waste and report that as part of the transfer waste?
So for that question, what the hauler needs to do, looks like Dan, you're turning your video on, so you might take that one. I'll pass that along to you.
Yeah, sure. So there is no requirement in Rdrs that you would handle material differently than your normal operations. So if that material is not normally segregated from your other flows, you would not need to handle it as such. Now, I will say in this case, haulers would not, to my knowledge, have the residual waste from processing. That would be a different role or a different type of reporting entity. In RDRS, haulers specifically carry material from the generators to a reporting entity, at which point then the processing would occur and residual may be a result. But reporting in RDRS is based on the level of separation of the material as you are handling it. So we're not requiring you to change your handling operations to accommodate reporting. It's simply report that material as you are handling it. In this case, if you're handling material that includes plastic waste, that would need to be accounted for in terms of your origins reporting. And Eric, please add anything if I missed it.
I think that was a great response, Dan.
Another question or comment from Valerie Meza. I feel like members of CalRecycle need to come and take tours of rural Northern California and see how we collect the information from the public. Tehama, Butte, and Shasta would be great locations for you to visit.
I think we all appreciate that offer. If you work for a local entity that would be happy to give us a tour, please do send us an email and we can go from there.
Omar Numer, will today's question and answer be transcribed and posted to the webpage as well?
Can you take that one, Priya? I'm trying to answer questions in the question box too, typing out our answers.
We could transcribe the question and answer from today's presentation as well and post it. From Valerie Meza.
I will add, when we post the recording for this workshop, the recording will have a transcript associated with it. So if you want to watch the whole seminar again and view it with the transcript, that will be available. Sorry, Priya.
Thanks. From Omar Numer, oh, sorry, I just took that question. From Valerie Meza, I will send you an invite to Butte Neil Road Recycling and Waste Facility. That sounds good. Thank you. From Ria Verghese, will the regulations affect how some tons are assigned to the host jurisdiction for a processing facility?
I'll go ahead and jump in. Yes, actually, I believe it will. In fact, what this may result in is as jurisdiction of origin are tracked for some of these flows that do contain recyclable materials, the result of that may be that the residual could then be assigned to the original jurisdiction of origin as opposed to the location in which the facility is located. And we do see that as a potential benefit, certainly for those facilities hosting large processors that do have the burden of large amounts of residual, did not originate in their jurisdiction, but they are assigned those tons as part of their 939 AB 939 calculations. So yes, this may affect that host assignment.
I'm trying to answer the past questions via text that we've already talked about via voice, but please continue to ask questions as you have them. We're here until, we're scheduled until 12, but if no one has any questions, we'll end a little bit early, but happy to keep going as long as people have questions. Thank you.
I was just kindly reminded by one of my team members that it's worth mentioning that facilities receiving material that requires a solid waste facilities permit to be handled should already be reported as a solid waste inflow and be tracking jurisdiction of origin. And where that's notable is realizing that a lot of curbside recycling has contamination rates that would make it so that it does not pass the 3-part test, thereby meaning that a facility would need a solid waste facilities permit to legally handle and process that material. Those materials should already, according to our regulations, be reported as a solid waste inflow because of that contamination rate. And so any residuals resulting from the processing of that should also be able to be tracked back to its jurisdiction of origin. So what we're really talking about here is for materials that include mixed plastic, but do not exceed the contamination threshold such that you do not need a solid waste facilities permit to handle it. That's where we'll see that added benefit potentially of the residuals from processing of those materials would be appropriately assigned back to the jurisdiction of origin.
From Valerie Meza, please send me your emails and I'll get your invite over to you. Thank you, Valerie. We can do that. From Larry Sweetser, will you include the questions in the transcript? I believe we will. From Stephen, Stephen says thanks.
So Priya, I'll answer the question that came in by email. Okay. Question on email, I'll just read it out, was how does SB 343 and AB 881 handle plastics that may be in screenings from wastewater facilities? So for plastics that are, and I assume this is really referring to plastics that are being screened out of wastewater material. So in that case, I think it depends on what you're doing with it, right? If you're screening out those plastics and it's enough that you're sending it to actually be recycled at a recycling facility, well, you should already be reporting that flow, that outflow in Rdrs. But if you're not if you're not sending it to recycling, if you're sending it to disposal, the way that would work under AB 881 is that you would have to start tracking origins for those materials, and you would have to provide those origins to the landfill that you're sending it to for disposal. I think this is a great example of something where it's going to be almost practically impossible to determine what the origins are for plastics that are coming out of, you know, a wastewater stream. I'm not really entirely sure how you would do that. So that would probably be an example where you would have to host assign those materials.
From Ria Verghese, the formal rulemaking process is expected to start in October or November this year. Is this when we can expect the first draft of the proposed changes to regulations to be available?
I'll answer that, Priya. Yeah, thank you, Ria. So we're hoping to provide the first draft of the regulatory text at or a little before our third informal meeting, so that the attendees can have some time to look at it and then provide comments or questions on the regulatory text at the third meeting. However, it's not a guarantee. We do have internal processes that we have to go through to ensure, you know, before we publish the regulations. That's what we're aiming for, and we're doing our best to make sure that that happens. Thank you.
Kat Garcia made a comment that the screenings go to solid waste disposal.
Right, and that's related to my prior statement, Priya, about the mixed plastic waste coming out of the wastewater treatment.
And actually, I would say that I think we might have been a little bit off the mark there, because that would be currently recorded as a solid waste outflow, and would continue to be a solid waste outflow. And so there's no new requirements on that, because you've always been required to indicate to the receiving facility when you're sending a solid waste outflow where it came from, which is your facility in this case, because you would not have any other origin information to share unless you did know exactly where that material came from originally.
From Ria Verghese, when will the slides and recording be made available on the website? I don't think we have a definitive answer right now, Ria, because the recording needs to be processed by our AV services. But as soon as they can get it to us, we will be happy to post it on the website. So please do check our rulemaking webpage frequently, and you'll be able to find it soon. From Larry Sweetser, will this rulemaking also be an opportunity to address other RDRS issues not related to SB 343?
Sure, I'll answer that, Priya. So
Yes.
as Priya noted earlier in the presentation, we are going to use this rulemaking as an opportunity to address other things in RDRS. We're not trying to redo, the entirety of RDRS, right? We're mostly aiming towards clarifications of existing points of confusion and other points of data that we have realized based on our own internal feedback and comments from stakeholders that would be helpful for us, such as if your facility is registered in the solid waste information system in Swiss, we are going to require you to provide that Swiss number in RDRS. Right now it's optional. So we're not going to be changing fundamentally how the system works. We're still going to be requiring origins to be reported, for example, but there are going to be minor tweaks here and there. And so you're welcome to comment on, and we encourage you to comment on those other things as we make them available. And of course, during the formal rulemaking.
So it looks like the questions are tapering off. So I'll pass it over to Priya in a moment. But one thing I'd like to say as a closing thought is we really appreciate and encourage suggestions on ways to improve and optimize our DRS as it stands now, outside of the changes required by 343 and 881. We will be considering those suggestions really carefully as we go through the rulemaking process. We can't promise that all suggestions will be implemented, but again, we will consider them and evaluate them, deliberately and carefully. So very much appreciate your participation and appreciate your continued feedback and help as we go through this rulemaking process. So over to Priya.
Just as a reminder, in case you have other questions or suggestions or concerns that arise after the webinar ends, feel free to send those to us via the rulemaking email. We'll be happy to, as Dan just said, consider them and respond appropriately. Okay, it looks like at this time we don't have any more questions or suggestions. So before we end the webinar and head out, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you once again for attending this webinar and for your questions and feedback. Please join us again on July 26th for our second workshop, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.